do you still think Robin Cook was correct?
Absolutely. I mean, he was instantly proved correct, I think, within weeks of the invasion. And as the search for the elusive weapons of mass destruction became more and more desperate and unsuccessful, his assessment of the state of play in Iraq was absolutely correct. Saddam Hussein did not possess weapons, which meant he posed a threat to the West. And he was successfully contained at that point. I mean, Robin had no illusions about the nature of Saddam Hussein's regime, and he had been willing to use military action in 1998 to enforce UN sanctions and to enforce compliance with the weapons inspection
Sorry to
process.
interrupt, because this, I mean, and actually, I don't know if you've heard, but there's a very interesting discussion between Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell on the rest as politics as they kind of go through this. Rory Stewart's very much on the Robin Cook side of things, although Rory Stewart said he's been on a journey on that. But Alistair Campbell makes the point very forcefully that this was the sort of argument that Tony Blair was making, and he was therefore making on behalf of Tony, which was, we knew that this guy was a dictator. He had got the capacity to use weapons, chemical weapons, on his own people. We were living in the shadow of 9/11. I mean, Tony Blair really believed in it, didn't he?
Did he? I'm not so sure. I and Robin certainly always defended him from the allegation of deliberately lying. But he did think that Tony Blair and some other colleagues had really gone through a process of self-deception. They knew that taking Britain to war in support of what the Americans were intending to do was an important political priority, and then they talked themselves into believing the arguments that were needed in order to justify that. I think that's what we saw here. Tony Blair, in some comments, makes it very clear that the major priority, the major thing at the front of his mind at that point was to stick as close to America as possible, partly because being close to America was needed in order to exert any influence, but also in particular, in the UK's particular case, and in particular the case of UK Labour government, they wanted to avoid any situation where they could be accused of damaging the special relationship. And everything that then happened really flowed from that political imperative of being close to America. It's not the case that I think they started with the conclusion that Saddam represented a threat and took it from there. They started with the need to join America and then constructed the justification around that.
And it's interesting because in the speech, Robin Cook does make the point that he just doesn't really buy the fact that Iraq is this huge material threat to the UK. The fact that the Allied forces think they can take Iraq quite quickly. To him, he says that's proof that Iraq is not this kind of big force. But one of the things I thought was really interesting, from certainly listening to what Rory Stewart has had to say on it, it's interesting that it doesn't seem that, well, certainly that's the argument he puts forward, that the intelligence was stress tested enough, and that's certainly that's the impression you get from that Robin Cook speech.
Yes, that's certainly true, and of course, there's a if you've already got what you think you need in order to justify what you realize you have to do, or you think you have to do, then you don't interrogate any further, just in case it falls apart in your hands, and then where are you? So that was another element of it.
Sorry. I mean, one of the other things, of course, was the fact that the war was won relatively quickly, but what was not won was peace of any kind. And, the sort of post-war plans kind of fell apart. And, many people argue the beneficiaries of what happened really were Iran. And then, of course, we had the sort of birth of ISIS. But one of an example that is often put to me and others when we talk about this is, has the pendulum swung too far the other way now? So you had Iraq, really emotions running high, people very understandably upset about it. Then you fast forward to Syria, and people take a decision, particularly in the Labour Party, that we don't want to have any intervention ever again. Is that right, David?
I think it is, unfortunately. I mean, I have very mixed feelings about the Syria situation. I'm not arguing necessarily that there was an intervention that would have worked. But by that stage, we were so psychologically crippled by the experience of Iraq that we never really thought it through to any extent. It was considered off limits, and when we got to the point where the Americans wanted to do something. I mean, it wasn't really much of an intervention. It was a sort of few token airstrikes that they were proposing. We decided, that the Parliament backed off. They refused to give the authorization needed for that to go ahead. So yes, it has framed our thinking, and not necessarily in very helpful ways, because there are situations in which we might need to use military power.
Well, that's sort of what I wanted to kind of ask the final question. This is a sort of difficult, but you knew Robin Cook very well. If Robin Cook were alive today, do you think he would countenance military intervention in another case if it was the right thing to do?
Yes, I think he would. And of course, he wasn't just in support of the intervention that we made in Kosovo. He was one of the leading advocates of it, and had been right through the 1990s in Bosnia as well. But the tests have to be high. First of all, there has to be an overwhelming humanitarian imperative to justify it. So an ongoing threat to civilian life on a large scale. And secondly, there has to be international support for it. If not a United Nations resolution, then a high level of multilateral support in the EU, NATO, and other organizations to which we belong, none of which was present in the case of Iraq.